Ronald Akers would go on to extend Sutherland's differential association theory in his work titled A Social Learning Theory of Crime. Akers is concerned specifically with how criminal behavior is learned, and he draws from various theories of learning in psychology. He argues that there are four concepts of social learning theory. These are differential association, definitions, differential reinforcement, and imitation. First, Akers discusses differential association, which refers to the process by which a person is exposed to normative definitions favorable or unfavorable to illegal behavior. Akers asserts that the groups that people associate with expose one to various definitions, and then they can serve as models that will be imitated. And he argues that family and friends are the most important primary groups. Also, according to Akers, church, school, and the mass media can be an important secondary group. Like Sutherland, Akers contends that the greater frequency, duration, priority, and intensity of the association, the greater will be the effect. Next, Akers discusses definitions. He refers to definitions as one's own attitudes or meanings that are attached to a given behavior. Akers argues that if an individual holds attitudes that disapprove of an act, then he or she is less likely to engage in that behavior. If, on the other hand, the individual holds attitudes that approve of an act, then he or she is more likely to engage in that behavior. Akers argues that an individual can also employ justifications or neutralizations in order to adopt an attitude that is approving of crime. He also contends that these definitions are developed through imitation and differential reinforcement. Differential reinforcement refers to the balance of anticipated or actual rewards that follow. These are the consequences of behavior which influence whether individuals will continue acting in a certain manner. This is based upon perceived rewards and punishments. If an individual is rewarded, the probability of that act being repeated will increase. Akers argues that differential reinforcement can be positive, which refers to a situation where one is presented with a positive stimuli. Also, reinforcement can be negative. This is when an aversive stimuli is removed. So based on this definition, negative reinforcement is something that the actor will desire and crave, and this is likely to encourage an individual's behavior. Of course, this is also a theory which is heavily dependent on other people. In fact, Akers posits that most learning is the result of social exchanges rather than non-social exchanges. Akers also discusses imitation, which he refers to as the engagement of behavior after the observation of similar behavior in others. He argues that both pro-social and deviant behavior can be imitated. In one of the more specific aspects of this theory, Akers discusses the social learning process by referring to sequence and feedback effects. This involves the balance of learned definitions, imitation of criminal or deviant models, as well as the reinforcement that produces the initial act. The facilitative effects of these variables continue in the repetition of acts, with imitation becoming less important. Also, reinforcement determines whether or not an act is repeated and how often. Interestingly, reinforcement can be of both a non-social and social nature, both of which influence future behavior. Akers also discusses rewards and punishments as they are related to group behaviors. For example, he argues that differential associations with others typically precedes an act of deviance. After associations have been established and the reinforcing or punishing consequences of the act are experienced, the continuation and seeking of new associations becomes affected. Akers also examines the social structure and discusses how certain macro factors have an indirect effect on an individual's behavior. In fact, as you may have gathered from reading the supplemental material in the Miller book, Miller and colleagues point out that Akers would later go on to propose a social learning and social structure theory. Akers explains that these social structures have the potential to influence the four factors, which again are differential associations, definitions, differential reinforcements, and imitations. And of course, as mentioned earlier, it is these primary proximate factors that have a direct effect on the individual's behavior. Take a look at pages 124 to 125 of the Miller book, as this offers a new, more recent take on Akers' theory, which is presented in the Colin and Agnew book. To be honest, there is much more to this theory than I have provided here, but in the interests of time, I'm going to move on. Before I do, however, I should point to at least one of the major criticisms of this theory. Some scholars question the reinforcement principle. For example, critics argue that youths become delinquent first and then seek out other delinquent peers. So there is what is known as a post hoc error. In other words, which came first, the chicken or the egg? And I think this is a fair question. The next work is one of my favorites, and it's titled The Code of the Streets by Elijah Anderson. It is an example of the cultural transmission theories that Miller and colleagues discuss, and then it focuses on ideas that form values and beliefs that are quite different from those in the conventional culture. In this respect, it is much like Cohen's classic work, Delinquent Boys, where Albert Cohen argues that lower-class males reject the standards imposed by the middle-class measuring rod. Instead, they turn middle-class values on their head, and they arrange an alternate hierarchy which gives them status. Elijah Anderson's work is in many ways an updated version that specifically looks at poor inner-city residents, typically African American residents. Anderson, who is also an African American scholar, argues that residents in these areas either accept street norms, which are opposed to mainstream society, or they accept decent middle-class mainstream norms. Anderson argues that the street culture has developed into the code of the street, which is a set of informal rules governing interpersonal behavior. At the heart of the code is the issue of respect. He argues that the street values acknowledge the code of the streets, whereas decent families accept more mainstream values. Interestingly, decent and street orientations may coexist in the same family, according to Anderson. He argues that children of street families are often unsupervised and learn to fight one another. Also, they often tend to come into contact with street-oriented adults who help socialize them into the code of the streets. By adolescence, most youths in these areas will either internalize the code of the streets or they at the very least learn to behave in accordance with its rules. Some may even learn to code switch, where they turn their street values on and off depending on the situation. And Anderson argues that most people in the inner city are not totally invested in the code of the street, yet he says a significant minority of youth are totally invested, which is very scary. As you read through Anderson's article, I think you can draw many correlations with Cohen's work on delinquent boys. I think it is important to read what Miller and colleagues have to say about the middle class measuring rod and how a subcultural framework develops out of rejecting this standard. This cultural resistance is also seen in Anderson's work, where juveniles are encouraged to act in a manner that is opposite to traditional values which are found in mainstream families. Let me say that besides being a subcultural theory and illustrating the notion of cultural conflict, Cohen's work is also a strain theory. And while it would be an excellent idea to read what Miller and colleagues have to say about Cohen's work for this week, this is still a theory that we will be revisiting later in this course. Walter Miller's theory also is presented, and it addresses focal concerns of the lower class, and it is what many have referred to as a pure cultural theory explaining gang delinquency. He argues that the lower class have defining focal concerns. Walter Miller is not to be confused with Mitchell Miller, the lead author of the supplemental book that we are also reading. Walter Miller published a study examining the focal concerns of the lower class in 1958. Shortly after his theory was published, the subcultural perspective fell out of favor to labeling and critical theories which opposed the oppression of the CJ system. So in many ways, I think Elijah Anderson's article is a contemporary example of subcultural theory. Like Walter Miller, Anderson contends that many individuals in lower class communities believe in fate. They are uncertain how long they will live, and they believe they could die violently at any time. In fact, they are often more worried about the threat of justice at the hands of their peers than at the hands of the police. If there's a loud knock on the door, they might actually be relieved if it happens to be a police officer who's there to arrest him rather than a rival gang member. And in fact, going to prison can actually enhance one's reputation on the street. This belief is especially prevalent among young men in the inner cities. Anderson has also published a number of relevant books on this topic, and besides being a cultural transmission or subcultural theory, one can see how values and belief systems are passed down from person to person in American inner cities.